And we're back again already, much sooner than I expected to be back. But I remembered there was something I've been meaning to tell you guys for a couple of videos now, which I just thought was quite interesting, and I always forget to actually tell you when I'm on a video. So we're just rolling that paddock that I just bought, so it's actually only a couple of minutes after I recorded the last video. So we're about, if we have a look here, I think I'm about halfway through rolling the paddock now. Yep, so I've done about half of it now. You will notice also that I've got my spotlights on, even though it's like just after midday in the game. The reason why is when you're rolling, it doesn't change the colour of the ground. It changes the texture slightly, but not the colour. And I don't know, I know I've got pretty bad eyesight, but I find it very hard to tell the difference between the two different textures. So when you're doing things like rolling, and same with if you've got a field that's cultivated and then you're seeding it, it's very hard to tell the difference sometimes between cultivated, depending on what kind of cultivator you used, and seeded. I find that sometimes when you've got jobs like that, if you turn the lights on, you can kind of see there, or hopefully you can see ahead of my tractor sort of thing, there's like two slightly different textures there, which is almost impossible to see with the lights off on the tractor. So yeah, one thing that I do, because I don't generally do any work, especially on any field work, after dark. So basically my tractors pretty well never use the lights really. But I do use them for jobs like this, where I'm just trying to see a texture difference. But what I actually want to tell you, and I'll just stop this for a second and jump into another vehicle for a second. So on this farm, and in fact on most, maybe all my farms, I don't remember if it's all of them or not, I've got Bedford trucks. So this one here, which the mod is actually a Ford F600, but it looks just like a J3 Bedford, so that's my Bedford J3, TJ3 model name. I've also got one over here, Bedford TK series, which again the mod is actually an International, but it looks just like a TK Bedford, so I'm treating it as a Bedford because Bedfords are an English brand, and England and Ireland of course are quite close together geographically, so I imagine vehicles that are common in England also on the whole pretty common in Ireland. So being a farm set in the 80s, and those Bedfords being 50s through 60s, I mean, you wouldn't normally have new farm trucks, so they're about the right age to use old Bedfords on my farm, I figured. Anyway, I was watching a video on YouTube on Bedford trucks the other day, and it told me something really interesting. Okay? Now, Bedford was a brand made by GM, so that's your GMC trucks and things like that. Although, as far as I know, the Bedford was actually an English brand. It wasn't a rebadging of a big GMC truck. I don't think GMC ever sold Bedford trucks under a different badge. I could be wrong, but I don't think they did. But anyway, the GMC badge, or GM badge, Bedford. But in talking about New Zealand for a second, because a lot of the stuff I do on this Irish farm, even though it's an Irish map, I do in a Kiwi way, like I have my Kiwi herringbone milking shed and things like that. Well, I was watching this video about Bedford trucks because there must have been over 1 million Bedford trucks imported into New Zealand through the 50s, 60s and 70s, late 50s through to mid 70s. And you never ever see one anywhere nowadays. And there must be some rusting old ones, you know, sitting in corner of paddocks of farmers' fields or something like that, but you just don't see them at all. And when you consider that New Zealand, well, back then our population was probably only about 3 million, to have about 1 million Bedford trucks in New Zealand, that meant there was one Bedford truck for every 3 people in the country, sort of thing. So New Zealand really was awash with Bedford trucks in the 60s and 70s and things, but you never see them nowadays. And I was watching this video on Bedford trucks and explained why. Now, I knew because even back in the 80s, when there were still Bedford trucks around and things, well, in the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of the Bedford trucks you saw were being repaired. So like they had Holden engines put into them, which is another GM brand. Okay, so it'd be equivalent to bring a Chevy engine in them, and things like that. And apparently the reason for that is, so yeah, back in the 80s, a lot of Bedford trucks were being repaired with Holden engines, or Chevy engines we'll call them here, but in New Zealand they were called Holden engines, to replace the Bedford engine. And I assumed that that was probably partly because to repair the truck and maybe give it some more power, and that may have been part of the reason. I was watching this interesting YouTube video, and apparently Bedford, like with car parts, you often find a lot of parts shared amongst different brands and things like that. If you need a new starter motor coil, chances are the coil that your car uses is exactly the same coil as is used in at least half a dozen other cars. So you've got a good chance of finding a second-hand one of the right coil, even if it doesn't come out of the car exactly the same as your one. But apparently Bedford designed and built a lot of their own parts, not just motors, but other parts that are still absolutely essential to actually hang on, what have I done that? So to running truck. So, and this video is talking about even things like, for example, wheel bearings. A lot of them are unique to Bedford trucks, and there was nothing else that used the same wheel bearings as what the Bedford truck had. So because they were made from the late 50s through to I think about the mid 70s from memory, a lot of these things have just worn out now. And even if you had an old truck for spare parts, probably the same sort of things. Wheel bearings is a good example. Wheel bearings would wear out on all of them, so you wouldn't be able to buy another old Bedford truck as spares, and use the wheel bearings out of it, because chances are the wheel bearings would be as knackered as the ones you had in your own truck. Apparently that's the reason that Bedford trucks just aren't around anymore. This video was saying that even in the UK it's very, very rare to see a fully restored Bedford now, because a lot of the parts are just getting into the stage where they're impossible to replace. So of course my farm here is set in the mid to late 80s, so Bedford parts are probably beginning to get quite uncommon, and I suppose if they're getting rarer they're also getting more expensive by now. So I'm not planning on selling those trucks in this game. I think they're the perfect trucks to have on my farm, the two old Bedfords. But they must be nearing the end of their lifespan, I suppose, by the mid to late 80s. As I said, you do not see Bedfords around anywhere nowadays, and given the number of them that were imported into New Zealand, that's just unbelievable, really. The other vehicle that was imported by the millions into New Zealand, or in fact I think there were also some of them were assembled in New Zealand, were Ford Cortinas. Now, for my American viewers, they won't know what a Ford Cortina is, because I don't think the Cortina ever got sent to the States. But you could look it up, you could Google it, it's spelled Cortina. And the Ford Cortina, again, was the most common car ever in New Zealand for a very, very, very long time. And there must have been millions of them. There was a stage, I can remember in the 80s, for example, when every third car on the road, it seemed. So I've always been a bit of a car guy, so I've always paid attention to the cars and things on the roads. And yeah, it seemed that every third car on the road was a Ford Cortina. They were absolutely everywhere. And businesses like them as fleet cars, and nowadays you never see a Ford Cortina around, or it's exceedingly rare. I do see one or two very, very occasionally, but it is just very uncommon. And I suppose that's the case of parts are getting impossible to find for some of these cars now. They're just getting so old that I mean, I don't know how long the company's required to continue making parts for a car for after they stop making the car. And certainly in the case of some cars, the Ford Falcon, for an example, a lot of the parts for the Ford Falcons are made by aftermarket companies now, so you can buy a part that's made using the original jigs and the original moulds and everything. It's exactly the same as the original, but it's not made by Ford any longer, the part. It's made by an aftermarket company instead. There's also food there, so that's all good. So I suppose with some cars you're going to have that sort of thing, and I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong here, because I don't really know, but I know AK will probably know the answer to this, or he may not, but his dad would know the answer, so perhaps AK you could ask your dad. There's probably some cars in the States, maybe old Corvettes spring to mind, because it seems to me that Corvettes, Camaros and Mustangs are always going to have a bit of a following. So perhaps there are either Chevrolet still make old Corvette parts that you can still buy new, or otherwise there's aftermarket companies that make replacement parts for old Corvettes and things now. But I imagine there's also a lot of other cars, your standard four-door family Chevrolet, whatever that was in the 70s. Was it a Caprice or Ford Crown Victoria, perhaps, like what the cops all used, it seems? Parts for something like that might be nigh on impossible to find now because people aren't restoring those cars, so there's no aftermarket market for parts for those. But I would imagine that Corvettes, Mustangs and Camaros, there would always be a market for some of those old parts, and that either Ford and Chevrolet would still make those parts, or aftermarket companies would take over and make them now. But it was really, really interesting to read about these old Bedford trucks. They're just not on the road nowadays because they just can't get parts for them. And it's not just the engine parts, because it's easy enough to repower one with an engine out of something completely different, but it's all the running gear. You're talking brake parts, brake calipers, wheel bearings, things like that you can't run a vehicle without those bits. But if no one's making them, then what you do. So that's all I wanted to tell you. So this will be a very short video, but that's why you're getting another video so soon. Okay, thanks. Bye.